Good evening, sleepyheads. Tonight, we bring you an unlikely friendship for the ages, where a yellow bird wandered into the White House, stayed for story time, and somehow helped free the nation's soul. Big Bird and Abraham Lincoln. One, the tallest resident of Sesame Street, bright yellow, endlessly curious, with a heart big enough to hug the whole block. The other, a towering figure in American history, president, poet, peacemaker, haunted by war and burdened by hope. It sounds impossible. But somehow, through the quiet magic of shared kindness and grief, they meet. What follows includes candlelit conversations in the White House, emotional visits to Gettysburg, crayon drawings from children, and a feather tucked gently into Lincoln's stovepipe hat. Together, they face questions too big for bedtime and answer them anyway. Welcome back to Bedside Biographies and another chapter in our Unlikely Friendships for Sleep series. A soothing blend of imagination and history, where legends from different worlds meet and become the friends you never expected. Each story is rooted in real history, sprinkled with warmth and wonder, crafted to help you wind down, drift off, and maybe even smile in your sleep. If these stories bring peace to your night, a small click on like and subscribe means the world to us and helps us keep creating more. And tell us in the comments where and when you're listening from. We love seeing our global circle of dreamers growing each night. So take a breath, let the stars settle overhead, and let the noise of the world fade as you fall asleep to one of the most unlikely friendships, the kind that never happened until now. The Bird in the Fog. Civil War encampment, 1863, Virginia countryside. Early morning mist. Abraham Lincoln sat alone beside a cannon. The fog clung low to the ground, as if even the air was uncertain. Somewhere in the trees behind him, a soldier coughed. A horse shifted its weight. Farther off, a drummer boy tapped a ghost of a rhythm against his thighs, too tired to fully commit to waking the troops. Lincoln exhaled slowly and let the silence settle again. The war was moving toward something. Everything was. But in this moment, it was still. He tipped his stovepipe hat forward and closed his eyes. That's when he heard it. Not boots, not marching, not gunfire. Humming, high-pitched, cheerful, unmistakably innocent. He opened one eye. There was a bird sitting beside the cannon, a large, yellow bird. No, this wasn't just a bird. This was a creature. It had feathers like a haystack in bloom, sleepy cartoon eyes, and two enormous orange legs crossed politely at the ankle. Draped around its body was a too small wool blanket. Perched on its beak was a pair of plastic sleep goggles pushed comically up onto its feathered forehead. Clutched tightly in one wing, a tiny brown teddy bear. Lincoln blinked slowly as if testing the fabric of reality. The bird blinked back. Big Bird yawned. Loudly. "Oh, good morning," he said, stretching his wings. "Did I miss roll call?" Lincoln stared. The bird looked around, taking in the rows of sleeping tents, the cracked campfire ring, the smell of gunpowder and wet wool. "Are we camping?" he asked brightly. "I love camping. I didn't pack granola bars, though. Do you think the squirrels would share?" Lincoln stood up slowly, brushing ash from his coat. "Might I inquire as to what manner of being you are?" "Oh," the bird said with a bashful flap. "I'm Big Bird." There was a pause. Lincoln raised an eyebrow. Big Bird extended a wing. Nice to meet you, Mr. Tall Man in a Hat." Lincoln hesitated, then gently shook the soft, feathery wing. "Abraham Lincoln." "Ooh," Big Bird gasped. "We have a statue of you on Sesame Street. Or maybe it's a snowman with a hat. Either way, big fan." Lincoln nodded slowly. "I see." Big Bird looked around again. "This place feels very serious." Lincoln gave a small smile. "It is." Big Bird tilted his head. "You look tired." "I am," Lincoln admitted. "Do you want to hug Mr. Teddy?" Big Bird offered, holding out his stuffed bear. "I appreciate the gesture," Lincoln said kindly. "But no, thank you." Big Bird tucked the bear under his arm again, patting its head. He's really good at hugs. They sat for a while in silence, the kind of silence that's too odd to break and too warm to question. Eventually, Lincoln gestured to the fog. "This is a battlefield." "Oh," said Big Bird. "That doesn't sound very fun." "It's not." Big Bird hugged his knees. "I don't like when people fight." Lincoln nodded. "Nor do I." "Then why are you here?" Lincoln looked at the ground. "Because sometimes doing what's right means standing in very hard places." Big Bird squinted. "Like when I had to eat Brussels sprouts." "Something like that." "And do you get in trouble if you run away from it?" Lincoln gave him a sideways glance. "You could say I'm already in trouble." Big Bird frowned. "That makes me sad." Lincoln didn't respond right away. He just adjusted his hat and looked toward the woods, as if listening to an invisible clock. "Would you like some coffee?" he asked finally. "I brought bird seed," Big Bird said, perking up. "Want to share?" Lincoln blinked. Why not? As the sky lightened, camp began to stir. Bugles sounded in the distance. Soldiers moved like sleepwalkers, rubbing eyes and buttoning jackets. A few paused, staring at the enormous yellow bird sitting beside their commander-in-chief. Lincoln waved them on. "They'll ask questions," he murmured. Big Bird nodded. "People ask me things all the time, like, 'Are you a turkey?' or 'Do you molt?' I just smile and say, 'I'm Big Bird.' Usually clears things up." "Does it?" "No." Lincoln chuckled, then stopped himself. It felt strange to laugh. The kind of strange that felt good. "You came a long way," he said softly. "However you got here." Big Bird nodded. "Sometimes I just show up where someone needs a friend." Lincoln turned to him. "And who told you I needed one?" Big Bird's eyes twinkled. "Nobody, but you looked like you did." Lincoln stared at the feathered creature for a moment longer, then exhaled deeply. "You might be right." Later that morning, as the troops formed up in lines, Lincoln mounted his horse and looked back. Big Bird stood beside the cannon again, watching him with a sad sort of smile. "Are you staying?" Lincoln asked. Big Bird shook his head. "Nope, I go where I'm needed." Lincoln nodded. "Thank you for the company." Big Bird stepped forward, took off his sleep goggles, and placed them gently on Lincoln's saddle horn. "In case you ever want to dream with your eyes open." Then, with one massive flap of his wings, he vanished into the mist. Lincoln rode on, unsure if what he'd just experienced was dream, miracle, or madness. But he felt a little lighter, and for the first time in days, he whispered not a prayer, but a thank you to a bird. Letters, Feathers, and Gettysburg, November 1863, aboard a train bound for Pennsylvania. The train to Gettysburg rumbled slowly through the Pennsylvania countryside, its wheels clattering like a nervous heartbeat beneath Abraham Lincoln's boots. He sat alone in a private car, his long frame folded awkwardly at a small wooden desk, a single oil lamp flickering beside a thin sheet of paper. Outside the frosted window, trees blurred like soldiers marching into fog. He dipped his pen into the inkwell, then stopped, then dipped it again, then stopped again. Behind him, a large feather fluttered softly. "I think you should just start with high," Big Bird offered, lying on his stomach across the velvet bench behind Lincoln, legs kicked gently in the air, crayons scattered around him. Lincoln turned slightly. "I'm not writing to Elmo, Bird. This is meant to commemorate the fallen. A formal address. Presidential." Big Bird rolled onto his back and looked at the ceiling. "Sometimes I think the best words are the smallest ones." Lincoln raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" Big Bird nodded. "Once I said thank you to Snuffy, and he cried." Lincoln let out a tired breath. "I fear I'll need more than 2 words to capture the weight of a battlefield soaked in blood." Big Bird sat up and waddled over to the desk. He looked at the mostly blank page and pointed to the first line. "407 years ago," he read slowly. "What's a score? Is it a math thing? I don't like math." "It's 20 years," Lincoln said, adjusting his spectacles. "Why not just say 87? "Because," Lincoln replied, "the weight of history demands rhythm. Gravitas." Big Bird blinked. "So, fancy sadness." Lincoln paused. "Yes, exactly." Later that day, the train slowed near the edge of Gettysburg. Fields rolled past the window, some golden, some bare, some still scarred with broken fences and twisted trees. The sun cut through the gray clouds like a decision yet to be made. When the train stopped, Lincoln stepped out onto the platform, greeted by military escorts, local officials, and the damp November chill. Big Bird followed close behind, wrapped in a wool scarf someone had knitted overnight on the train. It looked like it had been meant for someone half his height and none of his wingspan. No one quite knew what to make of him. Some stared, others whispered. One young boy tugged on his mother's dress and asked, "Is he the peace ambassador?" Big Bird waved awkwardly. Lincoln leaned over. "You may be the most curious creature to ever ride into a funeral procession with a smile." Big Bird tilted his head. "Is that bad?" Lincoln looked out over the fields and sighed. Number it might be necessary. They walked together to the cemetery. It was quiet, not the hush of reverence, but the deeper stillness that comes when the air remembers something too heavy to speak. Big Bird held a notebook. He had started writing a letter to Snuffy earlier that morning, but stopped halfway through. "I didn't know how to finish it," he whispered to Lincoln. "I wanted to tell him how the ground here feels. Tired." Lincoln nodded. "It is tired." They paused before a freshly marked grave. The marker had no name, just a number, one of hundreds. Big Bird crouched and placed one of his feathers gently on the soil. Lincoln watched him. His throat tightened. "You do that for all of them?" he asked softly. "No," Big Bird replied. "Just the ones who didn't get letters." Lincoln blinked hard. "How do you know which ones didn't?" "I don't," Big Bird said. "That's why I brought extra feathers." They stood together in silence. That evening, Lincoln sat by lamplight in a borrowed bedroom above a general store, the same sentence still staring back at him from the page. 77 years ago. Big Bird sat across from him, nibbling quietly on a cracker. "You know," he said, "on Sesame Street, when we want people to really listen, we sing." Lincoln looked up. "I don't think singing is quite the tone I'm going for," he said gently. Big Bird shrugged. "Just say what you mean." Lincoln set down his pen. "I don't know what I mean anymore," he admitted. "Every man I send into battle comes back with less of himself, or doesn't come back at all. I'm trying to honor them, but the words feel like polished stones in my mouth." Big Bird stood and walked to the window. He looked out over the rooftops, the church steeples, the flickering lanterns of families preparing for bed. "You told me once," he said slowly, "that sometimes doing what's right means standing in very hard places." Lincoln nodded. "Well," Big Bird said, turning around, "maybe you're trying to stand when you should be kneeling." Lincoln leaned back. "You're suggesting humility." "I'm suggesting talking like someone who misses them." Lincoln looked at the speech again. Then, without saying a word, he picked up the pen and started writing. Not like a president, but like a father. The next day, the sky was thick with gray and the scent of turned earth. The crowd gathered among the gravestones, men in uniforms and black coats, children on tiptoes, women in mourning veils. Lincoln stepped forward slowly. Big Bird stood behind him near a willow tree, wings folded in front of him. When Lincoln reached the podium, he paused. The pages in his hand were few, brief, but they felt heavy. He began to speak. The crowd quieted. Big Bird held his breath. For just under 3 minutes, Lincoln said everything the war couldn't. When he stepped down, the silence remained, not for lack of applause, but because no one wanted to break what had just been shared. That night, Lincoln and Big Bird sat again in the bedroom above the general store. "You were right," Lincoln said, staring at the embers in the fireplace. "The best words are sometimes the smallest ones." Big Bird smiled. "I learned that from Cookie Monster. He only says like 4 words a day, but they're always important." Lincoln chuckled. "A strange world you come from." "I think yours is stranger," Big Bird replied. They sat for a while without speaking. Then Big Bird reached into his scarf and pulled something out. It was a letter. "I finished it," he said. "The one to Snuffy." Lincoln nodded. "May I?" Big Bird handed it over. Lincoln unfolded it carefully and read, "Dear Snuffy, today I watched someone say goodbye with only a few words, and it worked. So I think maybe it's okay if I just say, I miss you, love, Big Bird." Lincoln folded it slowly and handed it back. "That," he said, "was perfect." The Emancipation Conversation, White House, late 1862, Lincoln's cabinet room. The door creaked open just wide enough for Big Bird to squeeze through sideways. He tiptoed, if one could call it that, with feet the size of Sunday turkeys, across the marble floor of the White House corridor and slid behind a very large potted fern near the cabinet room door. From inside came voices, sharp ones. "But, Mr. President, this will tear the Union in two. This proclamation is a matchstick in a barn soaked in kerosene. You'll lose every border state we've barely held." Big Bird's eyes grew wide. He had followed Abraham Lincoln to the meeting after overhearing the words "important," "freedom," and "bring snacks." He had only packed sunflower seeds, but now seemed like the wrong time to offer them. Inside, Lincoln sat at the long wooden table, surrounded by his advisers, Seward, Stanton, Chase, and the rest, each looking more serious than the next. The president's fingertips were pressed together, elbows resting on the table like anchors. He looked tired. He looked heavier than he did yesterday. He looked like a man trying to lift a country without dropping it. The Emancipation Proclamation lay in front of him, half-written, its ink still drying in patches. It was bold, it was enormous, it was dangerous, and it was right. Lincoln knew it. Deep in the quiet part of his bones, he knew this was the moment, the tide-turner, the paragraph in history that would echo louder than any war drum. But the room was full of fear. Fear of political fallout, of fractured states, of foreign perception, of losing control of a country already fraying at the edges. And fear, Lincoln knew, was persuasive. "Mr. President," Secretary Seward said carefully, "if we issue it now, in the wake of military failure, it will look like desperation, a bluff. The people will not see moral courage, they will see panic." Lincoln didn't look up. He stared at the document, as if waiting for it to finish itself. Big Bird leaned too far out from behind the fern, lost his balance, and knocked over a decorative bust of Thomas Jefferson with a thunk. The room went silent. 8 men turned toward the door. Then the door opened slightly, and Big Bird peeked in. "Hi," he said softly. "Sorry about your statue." Lincoln's eyebrows lifted only slightly. "He's with me." Seward blinked. "With you?" Big Bird stepped in carefully, dusting plaster off his feathers. "Hi, I'm Big Bird. I was just listening from behind the potted plant. Hope that's okay." The room was frozen in disbelief. Big Bird looked around. "You all look very serious, like the time Snuffy accidentally erased the alphabet." "Mr. President," Secretary Chase muttered, "do we proceed with the large fowl present?" Lincoln smiled faintly. "We've consulted plenty of hawks and doves. Perhaps a bird of a different feather will help." Big Bird sat carefully in an empty chair at the far end of the table. He looked at the parchment in the center of the table, the one with the heavy ink. "Is that the important paper?" he asked. "Yes," Lincoln said. "Is it about helping people?" "Yes." Big Bird tilted his head. "Then what's the problem?" Seward cleared his throat. "The problem is political balance, border loyalty, and the perception of power." Big Bird stared. "That means a lot of people might get upset," Lincoln translated. "Oh," said Big Bird, "like when Bert found out Ernie put his rubber ducky in the freezer." Stanton blinked. "But you still have to do it right." Big Bird asked Lincoln. Lincoln looked at him. What makes you say that? Because, Big Bird said, if someone's not being treated fair and you know it and you can help, then not helping is kinda like saying it's okay. Silence. Real silence. Not political silence. Not waiting for a vote silence. But the kind of silence that meant the room was listening. Lincoln turned to his cabinet. Gentlemen, if a 6-year-old can name it plainly, so can we. Stanton spoke slowly. But the cost. There's always a cost, Lincoln interrupted. But we are not being weighed for our comfort. We are being measured for our courage. No one spoke. Lincoln dipped the pen into the inkwell and signed the first draft. Then he turned to Big Bird. Would you like to hold it? Big Bird gasped. Me? Lincoln handed him the parchment. Careful. It's very delicate. Big Bird held it as if it were a baby bird made of glass and hope. Later, after the cabinet had dispersed, some in thought, some in disagreement, Lincoln walked alone down the hallway. He paused beside the fern. Big Bird was curled beneath it, softly humming. You're quite the diplomat, Lincoln said. Big Bird looked up. What's a diplomat? Someone who reminds people what matters when they're trying to sound important. Big Bird smiled. Snuffy would like that. Lincoln sat on the bench across from the plant. It's strange, he said. I know more words than most men alive. But sometimes it takes someone with fewer words to say the thing that needs saying. Big Bird tilted his head. Words are like toys. If you have too many, people trip over them. Lincoln chuckled. You keep saying these things that belong in my speeches. You can borrow them, Big Bird said generously. Just don't mess them up. They sat quietly for a while. Then Big Bird reached under his wing and pulled out one of his feathers. He held it out to Lincoln. I usually save these for birthdays or cookies, but I think today is a good day too. Lincoln took it gently. Thank you. He turned it over in his hand. So soft, so simple, but somehow exactly the weight he needed. That evening, Lincoln placed the feather in the same drawer where he kept his most personal letters. His son's handwriting, Mary's first note from their courting days, a dried flower he once pressed between pages of scripture. And beside it, the first copy of the Emancipation Proclamation. The next morning, Big Bird sat in the White House garden, staring at a butterfly on his beak. Lincoln approached and offered him a cup of tea. I don't usually drink leaves, Big Bird said, but I'm open to trying. Lincoln sat beside him. Do you think people will understand? He asked. Big Bird took a thoughtful sip, then wrinkled his beak. Nope. Lincoln looked over. But they'll feel it, Big Bird added. Lincoln nodded. Maybe that's enough. As they watched the sunrise, Big Bird leaned his head on Lincoln's shoulder. You know, he said, sometimes you look like a very big mountain. Lincoln raised an eyebrow. A mountain? Yeah, Big Bird said. You stand really still. You're strong. People yell at you like it's your fault the weather changed. But even when the storms come, you're still there. And sometimes, mountains need to sit with birds to remember the sky still works. Lincoln didn't say anything. He just reached up and adjusted his stovepipe hat. now slightly lopsided from Big Bird's weight. And for once, he didn't mind. A street called Sesame. Sesame Street, a timeless pocket of kindness, color, and very little logic. Abraham Lincoln awoke to the sound of laughter, a trumpet, and something being rhythmically smashed with a frying pan. He sat up straight. Gone was the quilted coverlet of the White House guest bedroom. Gone was the window looking out over the gardens and military drills. Gone was his desk and ink, his pen and paper. In their place, a brick stoop, a lamp post, a mailbox with googly eyes, and a smell, a curious mix of chalk, cookies, and bubble soap. Lincoln looked down. The stoop read, 123 Sesame Street. Big Bird sat beside him on the steps, sipping from a juice box. "Oh, good," he said, grinning. "You're awake. Want a string cheese?" Lincoln blinked. "I was not here yesterday." Big Bird nodded. "That's okay. Time gets squiggly around here." A blue monster roller-skated by holding a banjo and wearing a tutu. He saluted Lincoln. Big Bird patted the step. "Welcome to my world." Lincoln stood slowly, brushing lint from his coat. A high-pitched voice squealed nearby. "Is that the tall guy?" A red blur shot into view. "Elmo." Lincoln froze. Elmo ran full speed toward him and clung to his leg. "Wow," Big Bird brought the actual Abraham Lincoln to Sesame Street. "Elmo thought you were just on coins." Lincoln looked to Big Bird for help. Big Bird shrugged. "They get excited." "Elmo has questions," Elmo shouted. "What's an emancipation? Are your pants itchy? Do you sleep in the hat?" Lincoln took a slow breath. "All excellent questions." Elmo beamed. "Elmo's gonna go tell Abby you're real." And he dashed away, leaving behind a cloud of glitter and static. Lincoln sat back down. He has the energy of 5 horses. Big Bird offered him the juice box again. He took it this time. Later that morning, Lincoln walked the street with Big Bird, attempting to make sense of a town that functioned entirely on music, friendship, and limited adult supervision. He passed a group of kids doing sidewalk math. Grover was attempting to teach subtraction using cupcakes, but kept eating the examples. "That's 2, Grover said, mouth full. "Wait, now it's 1. And now, delicious." Lincoln smiled faintly. Down the block, a green fuzzy creature yelled from a trash can about zoning regulations. "That's Oscar," Big Bird explained. "He's our local municipal grump." "I feel a certain kinship," Lincoln murmured. They passed a stoop where Bert and Ernie were arguing about paperclip storage. "Are they married?" Lincoln asked delicately. "It's a work in progress," Big Bird said. At noon, a crowd gathered near the alphabet banner. Big Bird pulled Lincoln by the hand. "You've got to do the speech." "What speech?" Big Bird pointed to a chalkboard that read, "Today's letter of the day, L." Lincoln blinked. "You want me to?" "Yes," Big Bird said. "It's tradition." Lincoln cleared his throat and approached the front of the stoop. Children gathered. Monsters clapped. He removed his stovepipe hat, placed it over his heart, and said solemnly, "L is for liberty." Silence. Then, cheers. Someone threw confetti. Lincoln raised an eyebrow. "I think they liked it," Big Bird whispered. Cookie Monster rushed the stage, grabbed Lincoln's hand, and shouted, "And also for lunch." Lincoln stumbled backward. "Is he always this?" "Yes," Big Bird said. Cookie Monster panted. "Where cookies?" "C is for cookie." "But L is for looking for cookie." Lincoln gently handed him a leftover biscuit. Cookie Monster cried. "I've no idea what's happening," Lincoln muttered. Big Bird nodded. "That's normal here." That night, Lincoln sat with Big Bird on the stoop. The street was quiet now. Crickets chirped between the fire hydrants. "I think your world might be better than mine," Lincoln said. Big Bird looked at him. "It's definitely louder." Lincoln leaned back. "There's no war here, no hatred, just disagreements over milk cartons and overly dramatic snack emergencies." Big Bird swung his feet. "We don't always get along, but we always come back. That's the Sesame way." Lincoln looked up at the stars. "We tried that," he said softly. "Coming back, but people forget. Anger is louder than hope." Big Bird was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Not here." Lincoln turned to him. "Here," Big Bird said, "we teach hope louder." Before Lincoln fell asleep again, he tucked a crayon drawing from Elmo into his coat pocket. It showed the president riding a unicycle with Cookie Monster and a waving American flag. "Never thought I'd end up here," he whispered. Big Bird smiled sleepily. "I think you always belonged here. Just took the long way." Feathers on the front lines. Union Encampment, Northern Virginia, early spring, 1863. The camp smelled like burnt beans, wet wool, and tired hope. Somewhere past the rows of canvas tents and fire pits, a harmonica wheezed out a hymn too slow to be joyful and too faithful to be sad. Men moved like shadows, boots dragging, voices low, rifles slung carelessly over shoulders as if even war itself had gotten heavy. President Abraham Lincoln arrived on horseback that afternoon. He was there to visit the troops, as he often did, to walk among them, ask about their mothers, thank them for their courage, and carry the weight of their missing. But this time, he wasn't alone. Trailing behind him in a rickety horse-drawn cart sat one very large yellow bird. Wrapped in a dusty blue army blanket, Big Bird peered out at the camp, like a curious tourist entering a museum full of ghosts. His long legs dangled off the edge of the wagon. On his head, he wore a makeshift tin helmet that had once been part of someone's stew pot. Lincoln dismounted slowly, nodding to the saluting officers. "Gentlemen," he said, "I've brought morale." The men looked past him, then blinked again. Big Bird waved from the cart. "Hi." No one said anything. Then one private whispered, "Is that a tactical chicken?" By evening, Big Bird had made himself at home. He helped serve soup, albeit clumsily. His wing kept dipping into the ladle. He folded bandages, though some of them now bore faint yellow fuzz. He accidentally invented a new marching cadence by tripping over a snare drum and squawking in rhythm. And somehow, by sundown, he had a following. Not official, not organized, but undeniable. children of officers, wounded men on stretchers, tired soldiers with tin cups of coffee. They gathered near the main fire and listened as Big Bird told stories, not of battles, but of crayons and friendship and things with feathers that didn't require muskets. Lincoln stood at the edge of the firelight, watching. Big Bird was describing the letter F. F, he explained, is for friends, and for feathers, and for flannel, which I'm told is the official camp smell. That got a chuckle, then a laugh, then a deep, unexpected sense of ease. Later that night, Lincoln sat beside the fire with a few soldiers. Big Bird had wrapped himself in 2 extra blankets and was roasting something that looked suspiciously like a marshmallow on a bayonet. A young corporal with bandaged hands asked quietly, "Sir, where did you find him?" Lincoln glanced at the bird. "He found me." "Is he real?" Lincoln smiled. "I ask myself that every day." The corporal sipped from his cup. "He made Private Dobbs laugh, sir." Lincoln turned. "Dobbs?" The corporal nodded. "Hasn't spoken in weeks. Not since his brother." He stopped, looked away, but he laughed. Lincoln looked at Big Bird, who was now trying to teach a one-eyed cook how to draw a triangle in the dirt with a stick. "Then he's doing more than most of us," Lincoln said softly. Near midnight, Big Bird waddled over and flopped beside Lincoln with a dramatic sigh. "This camp is very heavy," he said, resting his head on Lincoln's shoulder. Lincoln looked down. "You've carried some of it." Big Bird blinked slowly. "I don't know how you do it every day." "Neither do I." Big Bird reached into his blanket and pulled out a tiny stuffed rabbit. "I bought backup for when I need to squeeze something." He held it out to Lincoln. Lincoln took it, held it awkwardly in his massive hand, then placed it gently in his coat pocket. "Much appreciated." Before they fell asleep, Big Bird looked up at the sky. "Do you think the stars look different when people are scared?" Lincoln thought a long while before answering. "No," he said finally. "But I think we look at them differently." Big Bird nodded. "That makes sense. I think the stars are doing their best." Lincoln smiled. "Just like you." Big Bird yawned. And for one quiet night on a weary front line, hope returned. Not with a victory or a cannon blast or a brilliant military maneuver, but with a 6-foot-tall yellow bird telling stories about the alphabet. Big questions in small theaters. Ford's Theater, Washington, D.C., April the 13th, 1865, the night before the assassination. The velvet seats were empty. The gas lights hummed softly. Lincoln sat alone in the presidential box at Ford's Theater, not because he had to be there, but because he didn't know where else to go. The stage before him was bare. No scenery, no laughter, just shadow. The boards creaked occasionally as if ghosts were rehearsing lines they'd never finish. He had come to think, and Big Bird had followed, uninvited but welcomed nonetheless. The great yellow figure now stood on stage, spinning slowly in a circle with his wings stretched out, making long, exaggerated whoosh sounds that echoed into the rafters. "This place is huge," he said, "like a storybook you walk into." Lincoln didn't answer immediately. He simply watched, watched the strange, feathery miracle that had somehow embedded itself into his life. Big Bird looked up. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" Lincoln blinked. "Why do you ask that?" "You've got your serious eyebrows on," said Big Bird, flapping up the steps to the box. "Those only come out when you're thinking too many things at once." Lincoln gave a soft grunt of a laugh. Perceptive for a bird. "Birds are good at feeling the wind before the storm," Big Bird said, settling beside him. "Also, I'm part canary." Lincoln gave him a look. That explains a lot. They sat in silence for a while. The kind of silence that only comes from creaky theatre wood and old velvet curtains and a century's worth of anticipation stitched into the floor. "I never liked this box," Lincoln said suddenly. Big Bird tilted his head. "Why not?" "It's got the best view." "Too far removed from the people," Lincoln replied. "Too soft, too safe. It feels dishonest somehow." Big Bird didn't know what to say to that. So instead, he reached into a pouch he'd somehow sewn into his down and pulled out a granola bar. He offered it. Lincoln declined. Big Bird unwrapped it anyway and took a loud crunch. "You know, I always thought theaters were places for pretend." "They are. But sometimes they're where people tell the truth too, even when the words are made up." Lincoln folded his long fingers together. "That's what I've always hoped. That stories can get to truths faster than speeches." Big Bird looked at him, chewing slowly. "You worried about what story tomorrow tells?" Lincoln didn't speak, but the weight of the answer hung in the air. From backstage, a voice called, "President Lincoln." Rehearsals wrapped. It was the stage manager, a short man in suspenders and perpetual panic. Lincoln had been invited to preview the next night's comedy, Our American Cousin. He had smiled politely, laughed once or twice at a line he didn't understand, and excused himself before the third act. He had, after all, heard enough acts in his life. Big Bird leaned closer. "If something feels wrong, we don't have to go tomorrow." Lincoln smiled. "You're not supposed to sense doom, you know. You're the light in the room." "I know," said Big Bird. "But lights can flicker." Lincoln stood, his tall frame stretched like an old tree reaching toward dawn. He walked down the steps of the box and stood on the empty stage. Big Bird followed. They looked out into the darkened rows of chairs. Lincoln whispered, "How many words have been thrown into the void from here? How many landed?" Big Bird shrugged. "Sometimes just one is enough." Lincoln turned to him. "Which one would you choose?" Big Bird thought hard, then smiled. "Forgive." They stood side by side on the silent stage, feathers brushing against black wool, two silhouettes sharing a pause in history before the next page turned. Eventually, Big Bird asked, "Do you think people will remember you?" Lincoln stared into the dark. "I don't know. I hope they remember why." That night, as they walked home under a canopy of gas lamps and blooming cherry trees, Lincoln's steps were slow but steady, his shoulders hunched against the breeze. Big Bird walked beside him, not speaking but softly humming, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star." Not because it made sense, but because some part of him knew that the man beside him needed lullabies more than logic. The Longest Night, Washington, D.C., April the 15th, 1865. The day after Ford's Theater. The sun rose like it didn't know what had happened. It touched rooftops, tree branches, and windows just the same, painting the city in its usual golden hush. Oblivious, or maybe stubborn. The birds chirped, the breeze moved, but Washington did not. It sat still. Like a breath no one wanted to exhale. Big Bird had not slept. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't even taken off the Honest Abe campaign pin Lincoln had once handed him as a joke. It was crooked on his chest now, pinned too high. He didn't care. He stood in front of the White House gates, alone as mourners began to gather. Some wept openly, some knelt in prayer, others just stared at the flag now hanging limp at half-mast. Beside the iron gate, a little girl stood clutching a folded note. She looked up at Big Bird, her eyes unsure. "Was he your papa?" Big Bird blinked. "No," he said softly. "But he was my friend." Inside the White House, the staff moved like ghosts in long coats and soft shoes. Everyone had a job, but no one wanted to do theirs. No laughter, no kitchen noise. Even the clocks seemed to tick more quietly. Big Bird wasn't allowed in. Not today. He understood. Instead, he wandered. Through Lafayette Park, down Pennsylvania Avenue, past lampposts where black ribbons had been tied. At some point, he sat on a bench and just stayed there, still as a statue. Pigeons cooed nearby, unfazed by his bright feathers. A man walked by and murmured, "He's too bright for a day like this." Big Bird didn't respond, but in his head he thought, he was too. By late morning, Big Bird found himself outside Ford's Theater again. There were flowers, dozens of them, lining the doorway, filling the steps. Children had drawn pictures of Lincoln, some tall and noble, others oddly proportioned but full of love. Big Bird crouched and placed a single yellow feather on the edge of the pile. He didn't pluck it. It had fallen earlier, somewhere along the walk. He figured it belonged here now. A man with a large camera offered to take his photo. Big Bird shook his head. "This isn't a moment for pictures," he said. Later that day, a White House aide found him outside the Smithsonian, head low, eyes distant. "You're wanted," the man said. "By who?" The aide didn't answer. Big Bird followed. He was led through a quiet side entrance and up a narrow staircase. The door at the top opened into the Lincoln family quarters, now dim, shuttered, and full of silence. Mary Todd Lincoln stood by a writing desk. She was pale, red-eyed, but steady. "I believe this is yours," she said, holding out a folded envelope. Big Bird took it with trembling wings. It was addressed in Lincoln's hand. "To my tall yellow friend." He waited until he was alone in a quiet corner of the East Room before opening it. It wasn't long, just a few lines, written hastily, maybe the day before. "Dear friend, I know you are not built for war, but you have fought for hearts, and that is no small battle. I may not have much time left, and if I don't say it tomorrow, thank you for reminding me of laughter, of lullabies, of the alphabet of kindness. Stay soft, it matters." "Well," Big Bird held the letter against his feathers and let out a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a squeak. no one saw. And if they did, they didn't interrupt. That evening, as the city filled with candlelight, Big Bird walked slowly back to their old favorite bench near the reflecting pool. He sat down. He unwrapped a granola bar, and for the first time that day he took a bite. He looked up at the sky. The stars didn't seem to understand what they'd lost, but Big Bird did. Feathers at the funeral. Washington, D.C., April 19th, 1865. Lincoln's funeral procession. The sky was dressed in gray silk that morning, as if the heavens themselves were in formal wear. Clouds hung low. Wind moved gently, like even it didn't want to disturb anything. Washington had never been so quiet. Not during battles, not during speeches, not even during snowfall. Big Bird stood near the curb of Pennsylvania Avenue, behind rows of hushed mourners. A little girl in black clutched his wing without asking permission. He let her. She wore boots 3 sizes too big and carried a single daisy. "Do you think he's really gone?" she asked. Big Bird looked down, then up at the draped Capitol dome. "I think he's just somewhere else, telling stories to stars." The girl nodded solemnly and didn't let go. The procession began with a soft drum beat. No trumpets, no cannon fire, just muffled drums, slow and steady like a heartbeat on its last leg. 6 black horses pulled the catafalque. The American flag draped over the coffin rippled in the breeze like it, too, was reluctant to move forward. People sobbed. Veterans saluted. Children stared. Big Bird removed his campaign pin and held it in both wings like a relic. It had been crooked for days. He liked it that way now. As the procession passed, he placed it gently on the road, just beside the wheel tracks. The daisy joined it. The girl still hadn't let go. A stranger in a bowler hat approached him. He held out a folded sheet of paper. "I was told this might belong with you," the man said, tipping his hat and vanishing into the crowd before Big Bird could respond. He opened the paper. It was a poem. He taught with silence. He led with grace. He held a storm inside his face. And now a bird, so loud, so kind, holds pieces of what he left behind. It wasn't signed. Big Bird folded it, tucked it beneath his wing, and closed his eyes for a long moment. After the carriage rolled on and the crowds began to disperse, a man from the War Department approached. "We're gathering personal letters," he said almost apologetically. "Things for the archives." Big Bird reached into his feathers and pulled out the one from Lincoln, the one that began, "Dear friend." He hesitated, then shook his head. "No," he said. "That one's not history. That one's mine." Later that evening, Big Bird found himself back in the White House garden. A few members of the staff nodded as he passed. Others smiled softly. In the far corner of the garden, under a tree Lincoln had once said reminded him of his childhood, sat a small wooden crate. Inside, crayons, stamps, letters from children. On the front, a brass plaque. "For Big Bird, because you were there too." He sat down on the grass beside it, ran a wing over the wood, opened the lid. Inside were more than letters. There were thank you notes, drawings. One child had sent a homemade paper medal labeled "Best Tall Comfort." He smiled. For the first time in days, He smiled. That night he stood by the reflecting pool again, alone. He stared down into the water and saw his reflection, soft, tired, feathered, full. "I'm not built for this," he whispered. And somewhere he imagined Lincoln answering, "You never had to be, you just had to show up." Letters and Lullabies. Washington, spring 1865, weeks after the funeral. The days stretched longer, and the ache in the city's chest slowly began to fade into something else. Not gone, not healed, but something that let people finally sleep through the night again. Big Bird didn't go home. He couldn't. Not yet. Not when there were still so many envelopes in that wooden crate. The one marked "For Big Bird," because you were there too. So he stayed. He moved into a small room above a boarding house near the Capitol. The ceilings were too low for his head, but the window overlooked the garden where the crate sat, and that was enough. Each evening, he pulled up a little table, lit a candle, and opened 3 letters at a time. That was the rule. Just 3. The first was from a child named Rufus in Kentucky. "Dear Big Bird, I think you are very brave to be yellow. My sister says yellow means scared, but I think it means sunlight. Did the president have any pets? Please write back. Love, Rufus." Big Bird smiled. He dipped a feather into the inkwell and wrote, "Dear Rufus, yellow does mean sunlight. You're right. President Lincoln had a dog named Fido. He also had goats. I think he would have liked your sister. Tell her not to be scared of yellow. Your pal, Big Bird." The second letter had no name, just a crayon drawing of Lincoln in a top hat, holding hands with a large yellow bird. The caption said, "You made him smile." Big Bird taped it to the wall. The candle flickered against the paper, making the drawn Lincoln's grin dance ever so slightly. The third letter was written by a child in an orphanage across town. "Dear Mr. Bird, we watched the procession. I saw you put down a pin. I want to do brave things, but I don't know how. Also, I miss someone too. Can you come sing to us?" He went the next morning. He showed up unannounced, just knocked on the wooden door with a soft tap. The woman who answered looked surprised, then overwhelmed, then quietly grateful. "I wasn't sure if you were real," she whispered. "I wasn't sure either," Big Bird replied. Inside the orphanage, the walls were plain and the rooms were sparse, but the children's eyes sparkled like they'd already opened their gifts. One girl gasped, "You're taller than the chimney." Another whispered, "Is it true you knew the president?" Big Bird sat on the floor, crossed his legs, and let them climb into his lap like it was a nest. He read to them. He told them about a time Lincoln lost a debate but gained a friend. He showed them how to fold paper into birds and how to sing the alphabet backward. He still struggled around Q. Then, softly, almost by accident, he began to hum. It was the tune Lincoln once hummed when his legs ached and the war seemed too loud. The one he'd quietly mumbled while Big Bird knit a scarf with too many holes. It wasn't perfect. It wobbled in places. But the children leaned against him and closed their eyes like it was enough. Later that evening, back in his little room, Big Bird stared at the last candle in the box. He didn't light it. Instead, he cracked the window open and let the sound of the wind sing him to sleep. The Feather and the Hat. Washington, D.C., months later, late 1865. The seasons changed slowly that year, like they too were still grieving. Leaves clung to branches longer than usual. The air turned cool but not cold. It was as if the world wasn't quite ready for anything new. Neither was Big Bird. He still visited the garden daily, still answered letters, still sat with children who wanted to know what Lincoln's voice sounded like when he laughed. Some days he taught them to sing "Twinkle, Twinkle" in 3 different languages. Other days he just sat beside them, saying nothing at all. Sometimes that was enough. One evening, a letter arrived in a delicate envelope. Cream-colored, edges pressed with gold. The handwriting was familiar, though more fragile than before. Mrs. Mary Todd Lincoln, Springfield, Illinois. Dear Big Bird, it's taken me time to write this. I wasn't sure if it was proper or wise or even kind. But Robert says you should have it, and I agree. It was the last thing he touched before leaving for the theater. It still smells like cedar and rain. You were his friend. A true one. Come if you're able, with gratitude beyond measure. Mary. He made the journey in silence. The train whistle pierced the countryside like a mourning dove. A conductor gave him his own booth, unsure of the proper etiquette for seating an 8-foot-tall bird in a black scarf. Children waved from towns along the tracks. A few old men removed their hats. At the Springfield station, Mary Todd stood waiting in full black morning dress. Her eyes were tired but steady. She held a long box. Without a word, she handed it over. Big Bird didn't open it until he reached the Lincoln home, a modest, quiet place with creaky floorboards and books that still smelled of ink. He laid the box on the dining room table, peeled back the linen wrapping, and gasped. There it was. The hat. Lincoln's stovepipe, a little battered, faintly dusty but unmistakable. It wasn't just clothing. It was identity, gravity, history, hope stacked on top of itself. Big Bird traced the brim with one gentle feather. It was heavier than expected. He reached for something tucked beneath his wing, a small, soft, golden feather that had fallen from him weeks earlier. He hadn't known why he'd kept it. Now he did. The ceremony was informal. A few members of the Lincoln family gathered on the lawn, a handful of neighbors, a pastor with a kind voice. Big Bird stood behind a small podium. It was too short for him, but he didn't mind. He spoke quietly. President Lincoln once told me that a good hat helps you carry the hard things. It makes you just tall enough to face what's above you, and just soft enough to remember what's beneath. I don't wear hats. They mess up my feathers. But today, I'd like to add to his. And with both wings trembling, Big Bird gently tucked the golden feather inside the band of Lincoln's stovepipe hat. A gasp rippled through the crowd. It glowed. Just slightly. Just enough. Afterward, people lingered to shake his wing. Some asked for hugs. One elderly man pressed a campaign button into his palm and said, "You remind me of him." Big Bird stood alone under the tree afterward, looking out across the fence at the town. A small boy approached him and asked, Were you his bodyguard? Big Bird chuckled. No, he said. I was just his friend. The boy thought for a moment, then nodded. That's even better. That night, back at the boarding house, Big Bird opened a new letter from the War Department. They wanted to display Lincoln's hat. They asked if they could keep the feather inside. He didn't hesitate. Yes, he wrote, but only if you tell them who it came from. A friend in the archives. Library of Congress and National Archives, present day. Big Bird had been to a lot of libraries. Sesame Street had a lovely little one, complete with beanbags, story hour, and a helpful librarian named Mrs. Finch. But nothing prepared him for the echoing vastness of the Library of Congress. He stepped through its marble halls in hush-padded sneakers, neck craning back to admire the domed ceilings and murals that looked like they'd been painted by clouds. His feathers fluffed slightly in awe. It felt like a temple made not for gods, but for words. He had come on a mission. After years of telling stories, giving speeches at memorials, visiting schools and cemeteries with Lincoln's stovepipe hat carefully balanced on his head, Big Bird had started to notice something. People were forgetting things. Not everything. Some moments still glowed brightly in history books. But little things, the kind that mattered. There was no mention of Lincoln's last afternoon walk with Tad around the garden. No note of the letter he wrote to a grieving mother that made Big Bird cry for 3 days straight. No photos of the time Big Bird had quietly sat beside the Lincoln Memorial, hat in his lap, reading Leaves of Grass aloud to no one in particular. And worst of all, some of the stories weren't just forgotten. They were wrong. One textbook said Lincoln was largely humorless. Another described him as a stoic bureaucrat. That made Big Bird's feathers bristle. Lincoln wasn't humorless. He had once taught Big Bird how to balance an apple on his head while reciting the Gettysburg Address backwards. He wasn't a cold politician. He was someone who cried when he thought no one was looking. Someone who once whispered, "I hope this ends soon," while they watched soldiers march through fog at dawn. So Big Bird came to the archives. The staff was skeptical at first. He had to duck to fit through the security scanner, and one guard asked if he was with the costume tour. But eventually someone recognized him from a C-SPAN broadcast about Sesame Street and civic engagement, and he was allowed into the records room. The air was cool, dry, and smelled faintly of old paper and mystery. He wore white cotton gloves like everyone else. His feathers stuck out at the seams. He spent hours, no, days, reading through personal letters, diary entries, newspaper clippings. Each one felt like a feather in a bird's nest. Fragile, important, part of something bigger. He found letters written by Mary Todd that talked about Abe's long silences at dinner. He found a telegram where Lincoln refused to punish a young soldier for deserting, simply writing, "He has a mother." Big Bird jotted notes in a little spiral-bound notebook with a giant crayon. He added hearts around the most moving quotes. He underlined names of forgotten soldiers and librarians and children who'd once sent Lincoln poems. But it wasn't until he visited the underground archive that things took a turn. The elevator went down 4 levels, and when the doors opened, he was greeted by rows of shelves and a single humming light. There was only one other person in the room, a historian named Doctor. Wilmer Graves, hunched over a table with microfilm spread out like scrolls of ancient prophecy. Dr. Graves did not look impressed. "I suppose you're here to find the story where Lincoln dances with Santa Claus or teaches bears how to vote," he muttered, not looking up. Big Bird blinked. "No. I'm here because I think some of the most important parts of his life didn't get saved." Graves sighed. "That's the problem with memory. Everyone wants to turn history into a bedtime story." Big Bird tilted his head. "Maybe that's because bedtime is when we're most ready to listen." There was a long silence. Then, slowly, carefully, Graves pushed a file toward him. "This one's incomplete," he said. "We've never been able to figure out the rest. It's a transcript of a speech he was working on, but the last page is missing." Big Bird looked down. The words were messy, handwritten, but unmistakably Lincoln's. "And so, when the world feels too large for any one man, when sorrow threatens to stain the sky, I look not to soldiers or kings, but to the quiet hearts that carry light." And that was it. No ending, no signature. Big Bird's feathers trembled slightly. He looked up at Graves. I think I know what he was going to say." Graves raised an eyebrow. "You do?" Big Bird nodded. "Because I remember when he said something just like this. Not to a crowd, just to me. We were sitting on the back steps of the White House after a very long day. I'd asked him, 'What do you do when everything hurts?'" Graves blinked. "And what did he say?" Big Bird looked back down at the paper, then quietly recited, "You look for someone who's hurting too, and you sit beside them, not to fix them, just to remind them they're not alone." There was another long silence, but this one felt different. Graves cleared his throat. Would you consider adding that as a witness account?" Big Bird smiled softly. "Only if I can write it in crayon." That night, a new document was added to the archive, titled simply, "Unfinished Words, Completed in Feathers." Author, Big Bird. Witness, friend, fellow dreamer. And somewhere, far beyond time and paper, Lincoln smiled. Feathers in the wind. Springfield, Illinois, Lincoln's tomb, present day. It was early. So early that even the robins hadn't quite decided if it was worth waking up. Springfield was quiet under a gentle blanket of morning fog, the streets washed in soft gray light as if the world hadn't colored itself in yet. Big Bird walked slowly. No cameras, no press, just his tall shadow stretching alongside him. His feathers were a little ruffled from sleep, and the little stovepipe hat he still wore, now slightly frayed at the brim, rested solemnly on his head. He approached Lincoln's tomb with the kind of care usually reserved for tiptoeing past a sleeping baby. The tomb itself rose like a quiet mountain, carved in stone, built to last, yet somehow still gentle in its posture. Flowers leaned against the base. Coins glittered along the railing. A few small American flags stood vigil in the soft breeze. Big Bird didn't speak. Instead, he reached into the side pocket of his overcoat. Yes, he wore one now, a tweed one he found in a thrift store in Chicago, and gently pulled out a letter. It was folded carefully in thirds, with Lincoln's name written in crayon on the front. The color had smudged a little from the train ride. He kneeled, a little awkwardly, and laid the letter at the base of the tomb. Then he sat, not because he had anything dramatic to say, but because he had learned, long ago from a tall man in a black coat, that sitting in silence was sometimes the best way to speak. The sun began to rise behind the tomb. For a long while, Big Bird just watched the light shift across the stone. It made the carving of Lincoln's face glow softly, as if the morning had remembered him. And finally, Big Bird spoke. "I miss you." A robin hopped nearby. "I know we said everything we needed to say, but it still feels like there's more." He looked up at the sky. "Things are still hard down here. People are still hurting each other, still arguing about who deserves kindness, still forgetting to look each other in the eye." He pulled out a small photograph, a Polaroid of him and Lincoln sitting on a bench, their backs to the camera, watching children play in the distance. It had been taken during their last walk through Washington. "I tried to tell them what you taught me, about patience and sadness, and sitting beside someone, even if you don't know what to say." The robin cocked its head. "I told them how you used to stroke your beard when you were thinking, how you whistled off-key when nervous, how you once laughed so hard at Bert and Ernie that you spilled tea on your lap." Big Bird chuckled. "I also told them about the hat, about how it was never magic but always kind." He took the little stovepipe hat off his head and placed it gently beside the letter. "Some stories are too soft to survive history books," he said. "So I tried to carry them." A breeze stirred. "And now I think it's time for someone else to carry them too." He looked back down the path, where a small figure was slowly walking up the path. A child, maybe 7 or 8, clutching a notebook. Big Bird stood up. He gave one last look at the tomb, at the flowers, at the coin offerings, at the hat and the crayon letter waiting patiently in the grass. Then he smiled. "Sleep well, Abe," and turned. As he walked down the hill, the child passed him, wide-eyed, curious, respectful. Big Bird gave a little wave. The child waved back. History had never really been about names in stone. It was always about what we leave behind for the next person who needs it. And as the sky warmed into gold, one feather caught the breeze. A bright yellow plume dancing through the morning air, rising, gliding, then disappearing into the light. Where the feather landed, the years that followed were quiet. Big Bird didn't talk much about what happened that spring. Not to Elmo, not even to Snuffy, but every so often, he'd sit on the stoop of 123 Sesame Street, feet dangling off the edge, and look up at the sky in that particular way, like he was listening for a stovepipe silhouette in the clouds. And Lincoln, well, he lived in the corners of archives and the folds of flags, in the pause before a president speaks, in a child's question about what's fair. He didn't haunt. He lingered, a long shadow, softened by a feather. They didn't always agree. Big Bird thought hope should be louder. Lincoln believed sorrow had its place. But somewhere in the long walk between war tents and alphabet songs, they taught each other how to carry grief without letting it harden, how to sit beside a hurt heart and simply be there. Once, many years later, someone asked Big Bird what he remembered most. He tilted his head. The way he waited, he said. Then he added, and the way he made space. Because Lincoln, for all his speeches and solemn portraits, had learned to make space for noise, for feathers, for feelings too big for grown-ups to say out loud. He'd watched Big Bird cry and not interrupt. He'd listened to laughter that made no sense and let it echo anyway. And Big Bird, he remembered the weight of Lincoln's coat when he leaned into it. He remembered how it smelled like parchment and winter and something older than either of them. He remembered how Lincoln never once told him to be quiet. The feather they'd written on, the one from the balcony in segment 4, was eventually framed. It sat behind museum glass in a dusty corridor, mislabeled as unknown artifact, likely toy. But every so often, a child would stop and stare at it for too long, and smile. Some friendships don't end with goodbyes. They simply become part of the story.